VRProud.com presents Candid Conversations, Breaking Barriers of Black Mental Illness. Now, here are your hosts, Jaron Jordan and Tavarius Haywood.
We start this part of our Candid Conversations talking about the past. We can't understand where we are now without understanding our past. Today we have Dr. Thema Bryant. She currently teaches psychology at the Graduate School of Education and Psychology at Pepperdine University. She's also known around the world for her work in psychology. She is a representative for the American Psychological Association for the United Nations, and she is a very popular podcast host and it's called Homecoming. Dr. Thema, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
No, I'm going to kick things off. Now, this psychological disturbance that we see today in many African Americans surrounding mental health did not come overnight. Can you talk a little bit about where we are now and take us back to the very beginning before our ancestors were forced to America?
Yes, thank you so much for raising this, because it is important for us to consider trauma on multiple levels. We have the trauma of a global pandemic, we have the trauma of contemporary racism, and we also have the trauma of what is called historical or intergenerational or ancestral trauma. And so recognizing the ways in which those consequences still show up for us today. So some may wonder, how is trauma passed down through the generations? A part of it is through our stories and what we are told. It also affected the parenting styles of our ancestors. When you are in danger, you raise your children differently in terms of the level of fear and the need to be vigilant. It also shows up in our bodies. There's an impact neurologically in our brains and physiologically in our bodies, and also through observations. We observed how our parents or grandparents would act in certain circumstances, and those were pieces that taught us how to try to function and survive. And so it is important that we think about healing the wounds of what has happened to us directly, as well as the wounds of what has happened to our ancestors, because it affects us in depression and anxiety and substance dependence, coping with emotional eating, in all of these different ways, as well as distrust. It affects our relationship with others, as well as our relationship with ourselves.
Doctor, help us understand the importance of the enslaved Black minds.
So when we think about psychology from the perspective of Black psychology, we want to raise liberation and empowerment, that we are not just looking to help people to cope with a system that is built on racism, that is built on white supremacy, but to really, what we would say, decolonize our minds or liberate our minds to be able to see ourselves as worthy, to be able to honor our humanity and the humanity of our sisters and brothers, siblings within the community, and for us to not define ourselves by the messages that we have received about our false inferiority. And so these messages, they show up in the media, they show up in the educational system, they show up in the criminal justice system. All of these systems often will teach Black youth that they are less or that they are inferior. And so it takes an active resistance to that to truly recognize our worth, our value, our dignity, our humanity, and our resilience. And that is when we are fighting against what we call internalized racism. Internalized racism is when you come to believe the lies you have been told about yourself. And so if you actually believe that our community is less moral or less intelligent or less beautiful, then you have internalized those beliefs that you have been taught. And so we need to actively recognize an important saying, which is culture is medicine. Culture is medicine. It is healing to be able to discover the beauty, the genius, the wisdom of those who came before us, because we do not only inherit ancestral wounds, but we also inherit ancestral wisdom. And so learning how we can not only survive, but also thrive.
My next question, I have about 3 questions in one. So I live here in South Louisiana, which is called plantation country. And on these plantations, we've read and we've researched the horrible treatment and harsh conditions of black people. Enslavers didn't even see us as humans. Can you define generational trauma? Talk about how these conditions of slavery on the plantation shaped those black folks back then, and the toll that it took on our ancestors. Also, how this generational trauma is passed down from our grandparents to our great-grandparents, etc.
Thank you so much for raising this question in this conversation. When we have experienced trauma, we also can experience what are called triggers or reminders. What are the things that bring to mind or bring to even your emotions or to your physical body a remembrance of what happened? And for many of us, the plantation is a trigger, is a reminder of those experiences. And so, what did plantation life teach us? One of the things that it taught us was to try to fly under the radar, to try to be invisible, that if you stood out, you could be targeted. And so many times, people within our community will recognize that if I really shine in class or if I really shine in my career, there are ways in which visibility can be dangerous for us and can be harmful. And so sometimes we can shrink back. Another piece that was taught in on the plantation was a competitiveness instead of collaboration. And so our community is largely culturally collectivistic. But when you get into a setting where some people are pitted against other people, whether we talk about house slaves or field slaves, or whether we talk about the issue of colorism, that there are ways in which we have been taught by design not to trust each other. And so then a part of our healing is healing our relationship within the community. But not only did we learn some things that are damaging, but we also learned some things that highlight our skills and wisdom. And so innovation, when we think about soul food taking scraps and making an entire meal. And so the ways in which that gets passed down, of course, the challenge becomes how we can celebrate that while also taking care of our health and our wellness is an important piece. Another important piece for us to remember from the plantation is how we learn to cope. A big piece of our healing and our resistance was our art and our spirituality. And so the drum is powerful, and the drum is a way to communicate, which is why on many plantations the drum was banned. And so in our music, in our singing, in our dancing, in our stitching, in our pottery, those are acts of our wellness. And then along with our expressive arts is our spirituality, that our faith has been a big part of the ways we have been able to hold on to hope in circumstances that were truly hopeless. And so recognizing the consequences of those traumas, but also pulling on the resources and the wisdom that was cultivated in those spaces is an important part of our legacy.
Can you define generational trauma, and again, how is that passed down to generation to generation?
Yes. So, generational trauma or intergenerational trauma is when one generation within a family or within a community experiences a trauma, and the effects of that are passed down to the next generation. And there are three primary ways that trauma can be passed down. One of them is physically. So we recognize trauma actually affects the brain. It changes the brain. And so when we look at the descendants of large scale traumas, we see that different portions of the brain function in ways that are trying to sustain a sense of regulation, internal regulation. The good news is that not only does trauma affect the brain, but healing affects the brain. So the key word in that is something called neuroplasticity. which is the brain can change, which we would say the brain can heal, that we can heal, and that when we heal, we can then pass that down to the next generation. So not only does the trauma get passed down in terms of our physical bodies, it also gets passed down in the messages that we are taught. When you think about if your parents told you that you have to be twice as good, or if your parents told you to never let people see you cry, never let people read your emotions, to mask our emotions, that becomes a survival strategy that was taught. That is a way the trauma gets passed down, and also through modeling. So we see by example the way those who came before us learned how to survive, sometimes by shrinking, by choosing silence, by working strategically behind the scenes. And so we learn that through modeling. So for each of us, you want to think about the wounds that I carry may not have begun with me, but the wounds that I carry have some of them predated me. And so, what did I learn from those who came before me that is showing up in my life? What is the wisdom I want to hold on to? And what is the wound that I want to heal?
A lot of people my age, my wife's age, a little older, a little younger, are asking these questions about generational trauma, from family secrets to anything about the past. But the older generation seems to be kind of pushing back. Why is that?
Yes. So I'm glad you named this because intergenerational trauma is not only about racism or slavery, but any sort of trauma that those who came before you experienced. And so if your mother or grandmother experienced sexual assault, it affected the way she thought about her body, the way she thought about intimacy, the way she thought about trust. And then often those messages were directly or indirectly taught to you. If you came from a family where there was a lot of intimate partner violence or domestic violence, it had an impact. And that may show up in your dating life, in who you choose, the way you respond to people that you care for, and the way you respond when you are dishonored or disrespected. And so the impact of all of these different types of trauma affect the way we think about ourselves and the way we show up in the world. And as you named, in this generation, we have been talking more about mental health, but sometimes when you try to have those conversations with older members of our community, there can be some resistance. And a big part of that resistance is just lived experience that many did not have what I would call the luxury of therapy. They just learned how to stuff it, to push it in the back of their mind, to pray about it and just move forward. But one of the things that we know is avoiding speaking about it does not mean we have healed. Being busy does not mean we have healed. Volunteering and being super active in the church does not necessarily mean that we have healed. And so it is an act of compassion and patience to be able to open the doors of those conversations, and some conversations that were never had, so they will be uncomfortable. But on the other side of the discomfort is our healing, is our wellness, is truth. Because we know truth sets us free. And a lot of families, as you named, have been locked into secrets and silence, and it shows up in devastating ways. And so we want to create the safety and the space to be able to speak the truth.
Dr. Thema, why do people still carry the negative response or the negative connotation to mental health as it pertains to the legacy of slavery?
So, one of the reasons why people will hold stigma about having mental health consequences of racism and of slavery is because our educational system has often diluted the realities of what enslavement was. And as long as we have history books and social studies books that give it one sentence, that say they were slaves and they were happy and then they were free and now they can be even happier, right? When we have that simplistic view, it does not make sense that it would have the sting and the consequence that it has. And so, in order to remove the stigma or to raise awareness about these mental health consequences, requires an actual truth telling and education about the process of enslavement. In South Africa, in the aftermath of apartheid, they created a truth and reconciliation committee, a truth and reconciliation process, recognizing we cannot just say, let's move forward when we are still not telling the truth. And so it is the silence around the impact of slavery that has kept some from recognizing that the mental health consequences. In addition to that, is the reality that oftentimes there is this labeling of people who talk about racism as saying you're using an excuse. So some people will say, oh, it was a long time ago and you all shouldn't talk about it anymore. And that also is an act of racism to say whose history is okay to talk about, is acceptable to talk about, and whose history must be silenced. And so to be able to counter the pressure for silence, to recognize that a part of our wellness, not only for Black people, but as a nation, that our wellness will require us being willing to speak the truth. The last thing I will say about the ongoing consequences is that the reality is, after the Emancipation Proclamation, and later than that, a year later, after Juneteenth, it is not as if Black people were then treated with fairness and with equity and with justice. So the reality is, even though we can look back on Juneteenth, we can look back on the Emancipation Proclamation, we have to look at over the generations the systemic ways in which oppression has been kept alive in every system. And this has been documented, so it's not just personal opinion. But when we look at the research, if people turn in an application for a home loan and you make the application identical, except you give one person a Black sounding name and give the other person what would be considered an American or traditional European name, then the person with the Black sounding name is less likely to receive the loan. The same thing if you apply for a job, if you apply for college, if you apply for housing. If the application is the same except for the name, we see this discrimination showing up. And so the consequences are not just because of our history, but also because of our present.
Doctor, I read an article a few weeks ago. It says we have overcome the physical barriers of slavery and racism, but how far have we come psychological and emotionally? That touched me in a way that I didn't even realize that could be touched. Why does it seem like we haven't came far?
Yeah. So Dr. Maya Angelou had a beautiful quote which says, surviving is necessary, but thriving is elegant. And I think for a lot of us, we have been in survival mode, just trying to make it through the day, trying to make it through the year, trying to make it through the pandemic. And so when we are stuck in survival mode, which is in large part because of ongoing oppression, and I should mention, Black people are more likely to face intergenerational poverty, persistent poverty versus transient poverty. So it is not just a matter of are we motivated? You can be motivated, but the resources and access to resources can be blocked. And so that can delay our growth, our wellness, our healing, and our thriving. And so it is important for us to create spaces where we can be honored, where we can heal, and when we can really tap into our strengths. And so for each of us, we can ask the question as we reflect on ourselves, have I just been surviving? And if I have been surviving, I want to appreciate that because survival is important. And then what are the things that I need in my life that would create access and opportunity for me to flourish, for me to heal, for me to thrive? And I want to say a part of that is justice. Justice is therapeutic. right? That when there is fairness and equity, that can decrease some of the anxiety and the hypervigilance that we have. And so, along with justice, I would say also creating permission and safe spaces for culturally congruent, for culturally attuned therapeutic practices. And so, for us to be willing to get the sessions, whether individual, couples, family, or group, that we are deserving and we are worthy of healing, of wholeness, and wellness.
How can we destigmatize mental health in the Black community?
One of the key ways to destigmatize mental health in our community are those who are gatekeepers or leaders in our community, role models in the community, to be willing to seek services and then to speak about it. So I'm based in Southern California in Los Angeles. And when I have heard pastors speak to their congregation about going to therapy themselves, it frees up a lot of people to know, well, if pastor could go or pastor needed it, then maybe I could benefit from it too. We have also had in the past number of years Black celebrities, whether actors or athletes, speaking up about mental health. And that helps to remove the stigma as well, that these are people I admire. These are people that I think of as smart or as strong or as successful. And they're saying that this can be a useful tool that we do not want to deny ourselves, and that can help to remove the stigma. And then I must say, on the side of psychology and mental health professionals, that it is important that when people take that courageous step of seeking services, that they're met with someone who is culturally affirming and who pays attention to culture and recognizes the realities of oppression so that they are not further harmed in the mental health system.
I did a little research on the civil rights movement and mental health back then. It wasn't a lot of information there. Can you talk a little bit about the civil rights movement and the mental health process then?
Yes. So, one of the things that we want to keep in mind when we consider the civil rights movement is the role psychologically of hope and faith. So often, when I mention psychology or when other people mention psychology, we usually think about the illness, mental illness, or pathology. So you might think about addiction, depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. But there is another aspect of psychology called positive psychology, where we look at the attributes that help us to cope, heal, and thrive. And so, two of those attributes that we can see very actively in the civil rights movement are hope and faith. So, what allows us to keep moving forward? What allows us to keep working toward progress? There has to be a piece of us, and we would say, even if it's the size of a mustard seed, that there's a part of me that believes that things can be better, that they can be better for me as an individual, for my family, and for the larger community, and for this nation. And when I believe that, it allows me to stay engaged and to know this other piece of faith without works is dead. So even if I have hope and faith, then what are the concrete actions that I'm doing to make things better? So what we saw in the civil rights movement was collective action. So while we might highlight particular leaders like Dr. King, we would also recognize that there is no impact of King if there are not an army, if there's not an army of collective people who are willing to be actively engaged in the movement. And so for each of us, we want to think about feeding and nourishing our hope and our faith, but then saying, once that is nourished, how do I want to show up in order to contribute to progress? And that is an important piece that, despite our fears, despite our anxiety, despite even depression and grief, that I want to be a part of the solution. And that's what we see from the example of the civil rights movement.
How can we help those people who are in that generation who our generation are seeing the resistance there when it comes to having those tough conversations. How can we help them talk about these things?
So, one of the things that is helpful whenever you want to consider confrontation or a difficult dialogue, is there anything praiseworthy? Right? If we are coming to someone for a conversation and we only have the complaint, it will be hard for the person to hear it. So it's like with any relationship. If someone knows that I am their friend or that I care about them, then even if I have some difficult feedback to give them, they know that it is given, that I am sharing it or speaking it from a place of compassion. So if you want to speak with family members or elders in the community about some things that were done that were not good or were not healthy or that you think should not have happened, I would encourage you to also think about, is there anything they got right? Right? So for some of us, you would say, oh, my parents or grandparents didn't prepare me for this because we did not have this conversation. Okay, so that is some honest feedback that you want to give them. And I would just raise the question, is there anything that you appreciated about their parenting? Is there anything that you learned from them? And you don't have to lie about it. If there's nothing, there's nothing. But for many of us, people are complicated and layered, and there may be some good stuff that went along with the things that were problematic. And if we can share all of that, it creates a space for people to better be able to hear the concerns that we want to raise. And the last thing I'll just say about confrontation is to really be liberated from needing a certain response from people. Like if I go to them and I need them to say they're sorry, then I am holding my healing hostage. But instead, if I go to them and whether they apologize or not, whether they acknowledge it or not, I am here to speak truth. And in my speaking of the truth, I am freeing myself.
Doctor, this is the last question, I promise. What tips can you give us to start that healing journey?
Yes, I am so glad for the opportunity, and there are some concrete things we can do to take care of ourselves. And I would say think holistically, physically, emotionally, spiritually, relationally. So, in your physical body, watching what you eat and knowing that what I nourish myself speaks into my health, into my life, into my value. So, when I start making food choices, if I can say, I'm eating this because I love myself. Right. And so, along with watching what we eat, drinking water, moving these bodies. There's a lot of stress in our bodies, and there's actually research that shows that talk therapy alone does not heal the trauma. That a part of the trauma is locked in our bodies, and our muscles are often tight. We may have migraines, nausea, backache. And so, to get out and start walking or dancing or sports, whatever physical activity you can do. And then emotionally, I would encourage journaling, meditation. I would also encourage talking to supportive friends and having boundaries. People who stress you out, needing to be selective about how much access I give them to my life. And then that big step of being willing to go to therapy. To make that call, and many mental health professionals are offering sessions online, so you don't even have to deal with a commute. And so to say during this season, I'm in a global pandemic and I deserve a space where I can work on my wellness. And the last thing I'll just mention are self help books. And so you can find some workbooks online for whatever your issue is. So you can put in, as you search, anxiety workbook, grief workbook, depression or PTSD workbook, if you prefer to do that or in addition to doing the therapy. And so when we're able to prioritize our wellness, we will start to see a major shift. And the last thing I will mention is rest, to allow yourself to lay down and not say yes to too many things. We stretch ourselves too thin, and so we are worthy and deserving of rest.
Anything else you'd like to add, Dr. Thema?
I am so appreciative of this time to share. And as you mentioned in the beginning, I lead a mental health podcast, which is called Homecoming, and I encourage your viewers to take a listen. It's on all the major platforms, and it can give you some more mental health tips.
All right, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Thema. The conversation continues coming up next.